Hi, everybody. Welcome to our monthly Hope for Mental Health community. So glad that you've decided to join us today. We are also excited that sometime soon, we hope to be able to resume our in-person gathering monthly. For those of you who live out of the area, you'll still be able to access it online, but we're just so pleased that there's this kind of progress in the COVID-19 pandemic that will open up that very distinct possibility sometime soon, very soon. So today we're going to be talking about the topic, what happened to you? It's based on a best-selling book that I think you're going to want to get. It's an amazing book, but just to give you kind of a taste of what it is we'll be talking about. Can you think of a time that you were talking to somebody else and they responded with either anger or fear in a big way, in such a way that it almost surprised you? You drew back like, whoa, what was that all about? Or, if you were describing it to somebody else, you would say, man, out of the blue, this person, he or she just erupted, or he or she just acted in this way that I was so surprised. I didn't even say anything or do anything. And I don't know what was the matter with him. What was the matter with her? Or maybe you've had that experience and you've been the person who has done the erupting or the unusual response that didn't seem to be fitting for the type of conversation. Like it was over the top, or it was underwhelming, and you thought to yourself, why did I act that way? Or why did I respond in that way? Well, those kind of responses are a clear clue that we are tapping into a trauma memory that is stored in our brains. We're not usually very aware of the associations that we make to what happened to us when we were younger, to how it makes us act or behave today. But we're going to learn today that our behaviors begin to shape themselves around the emotional landmines left by previous trauma. And the whole point of our conversation today is that when you know what happened to you, a lot of your own behavior will begin to make sense. And when you know what happened to somebody else that you're interacting with, a lot of their behavior will begin to make a whole lot more sense as well. So I brought Dr. Bruce Perry. He was with us last year in April of 2020, and I've looked forward to having him back again. He is the principal of the Neurosequential Network. He's a senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy and a professor in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University of Chicago. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Perry has been an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and the neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. His work on the impact of abuse, neglect, and trauma on the developing brain has impacted clinical practice, programs, and policy across the world. His experience has led him to become one of the most sought-after experts following national tragedies. He's the co-author of The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a best-selling book based on his work with maltreated children, and Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. And then his most recent book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing, co-authored with Oprah Winfrey, just released a few weeks ago. So please welcome Dr. Bruce Perry. So Dr. Perry, we are going to talk about your new book in just a moment, but I just thought it was interesting for the Hope for Mental Health community that we're talking to today. It was a year ago. I interviewed you a year ago in April, just at the beginning, pretty much of the pandemic in the US. And we were talking about how stress impacts us, but it was all in that context of this pandemic that we thought was not going to last that long. I mean, I'm sure there were scientists by that time who were pretty sure we were in for a rough ride, but I think the average people, we just kept thinking, hey, this is going to subside quickly. This is going to be like a winter storm. And then we realized, no, this is not like a winter storm. This is more like the ice age and, that we needed a new strategy. But so just for that community who got to hear you a year ago, can you tell me now, 13 months later, just briefly, what are your takeaways from how the pandemic and everything that happened to us, how's it going to affect us going forward? Really, you don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but I just wanted to bring that full circle from last year to this year.
Yeah, it's, I think a lot of the things that we talked about are relevant for understanding where we are now. Uh, but I think one of the most permeating experiences for people is a real life experience with how exhausting chronic stress can be. And whether or not it's a low level inconvenience and too many decisions and too much going on, uh, to the kind of real stress that has to do with housing and food and employment and illness in your family. The chronic nature of this has just been physically and emotionally exhausting. And I think that that's the most sort of consistent observation that I've seen.
Mm.
And there are good parts to that and there are bad parts. Now, the good part is that for those of you who are listening, and Kay, of course, with your work and my work, part of what we're always trying to help people connect with is the pain of people who have less than we do, of the distress that they have to live with. And it helps us be more empathic when we can emotionally connect. And I think that this is going to make it easier for a lot of people to realize that, wow, I do have a little bit of a glimmer of what it really means to have continuous uncertainty and unpredictability and stress. And maybe that'll make me a little bit more compassionate and sort of make it easier to be in somebody else's shoes when I'm thinking about a certain situation. So I think that's a potential positive. I think one of the negatives and one of the things we have to really worry about is how tired we all are in the transition back to what we're going to consider the new normal. And that this new normal, it has to really should take advantage of the learnings that we've had over this last year. But I think so many people are just so tired that even the idea of having a planning process or like another meeting or like it's just, I think we're just all tired. I think we need to recognize the power of rest and go slow. I think if we go slow, we will go further in education, in mental health redesign and child welfare redesign, all these areas where we realize that we need to make change. I think if we sort of slow down, if we kind of are patient with each other, if we kind of get recharged, then we'll be in and then reflect on what it is that we've learned. Then I think this reinvention process will go better.
My husband is going to be so happy that you just said all of that, because our church just reopened Palm Sunday. So the week before Easter, we had started in-person services again. And he's been preaching almost every weekend about going slow, taking our time, not being in a rush to, that we have to rebuild our lives, and that takes time and intentionality and I mean, almost exactly. He's going to be so happy to know. He already loves you to pieces. So
the wise man.
He's going to feel, yeah, he's going to feel very reinforced to know that what he's been saying is even backed up by, science and the wisdom of those who are really trying to help us find a new way forward. When we got on a few minutes ago, you asked how I was doing, and I had come rushing in, and I'm like, I'm great. And I said, mostly. And you said, well, most people I talk to are not saying they're great. And my most honest answer, that was the polite, hi, how are you? How you doing? That was my polite answer. But really the most honest answer is, I can concur with that, is what I've been saying to people is, I'm not doing well, but I'm all right.
Right. I think that's such an important thing, I think, on a couple of levels. One is that honesty is always a powerful bonding thing. When somebody actually is honest with you, you're like, wow, this is a real interaction.
Yeah.
And you're really going to be here with me. You're giving me a gift. It's gifting something to me. And then I think that opens the door to this honest transaction about, wow, this has been hard, hasn't it? And how are you really managing? And can I help? All of this stuff that I think that's really important in sort of rebuilding the new us.
I think it's for me, I think what I've learned, what I'm learning in that, I wouldn't say I've learned, I'm learning is how to distinguish between saying, I'm not all right. I mean, I'm not well, I'm not doing well, but I'm all right. And I'm not doing well and I'm in trouble,
Yeah.
or I'm like kind of going down the slippery slope here. And I think most of the time we're afraid to say, I'm not doing well, because either it puts other people in a panic, or we just don't want it. That feels too negative to us. But there really is, I think, something very reassuring in these days to be able to say to each other, I'm really tired. I'm not really doing well. I'm struggling with even the stress of reopening and the conflicting messages from um, government and CDC and everybody, our own state mandates. It's like I can't think of all of this. So to be able to say, I'm not doing well with that, but I'm all right, is just feels like it allows us to, as you say, be honest, and to then be able to tell ourselves those signs of, no, I'm not only not doing well, I probably need some help.
Yeah.
And so that's been probably one of the biggest takeaways for me. Well, I really want to spend the bulk of our time talking about your new book that you've just written with Oprah. What happened to you? Really, I'll show you this first because this is the pretty thing. What happened to you? Conversations on trauma, resilience, and healing that you wrote with Oprah. However, my book is, I took the cover off because I didn't want to mess it up. And I not only, highlighted just about every page, but I also used all these cute little sticky things. The problem is I ran out of sticky things. So I have probably the last 4 chapters that I have to go back and add sticky things to, because it was every one of those reflects something so significant, so meaningful on a page. I can't thank you enough. It's a master class, worthy of many, many hours of conversation. And I know that's why you've spent your life devoted to this, and why I actually had a thought this morning that I hope there's somebody watching this, or somebody who reads your book or watches one of the millions of interviews that you've been giving lately around your book, that they will be as captured and captivated as you have been about trauma and its effect on people and how to bring healing and hope to them. I really hope there's somebody else who then walks away and goes, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to do that.
I would love that. I think one of the most gratifying things for me is when somebody like you basically looks at this and reads it, and it resonates with your experience, and it makes you think a little bit differently, and it generates conversation. And I find that something that's really the aspiration of this book, was to get people in every walk of life to recognize that these are really important concepts and principles, and they can help you. They can help you understand yourself. They can help you understand the people you interact with. And then again, to stimulate conversation. But for me, the greatest thing would be just what you mentioned, that somewhere out there's a 15, 16, 17-year-old kid who says, wow, this is important. And in 15, 20 years, that person will have sort of pushed our field further forward. And I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, I have to tell you, the book made me cry a lot. You may hear that, but it did. It was so moving. It's full of stories, heartbreaking stories of children and the suffering that they experience early in life. And I cried for Oprah as she tells her story. I wept for her. I cried for the individual children whose stories you tell. I cried for the adults that you have worked with through your life's work. I cried for the people in my life who I know are even now unraveling, untangling the threads of what happened to them. I cried a little for myself and my own experiences with trauma in early life, but it wasn't sad. I don't know how to explain that. It was moving. And I was so touched by it. but I wouldn't want anybody listening to that say, well, then I better not read that book because that's just one of those sad books and I don't have any space to cry. It was achingly hopeful.
You're going to make me cry. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the challenges when you do this work is that it's so emotionally intense, to see the painful experiences of the children and the adults that you work with. We talk about it in the book. One of the things about human beings is that we're contagious to the emotions of other people. And this is part of what helps us be empathic and be caring for others, but it also makes us vulnerable to the pain and distress of other people. And so part of what the challenges was with this book was that we want people to see these things and understand them, but we don't want it to be so overwhelming that it's sort of like one of those commercials on TV where you see starving children and you can only watch it for 2 seconds and then change the channel. We wanted it to be a moderate, predictable challenge, sort of a resilience building experience. And we talk about that in the book, that stress in and of itself isn't a bad thing. But when you activate the stress response system in either prolonged or extreme ways, it's overwhelming and it can be very dysregulating. But if it's moderate and predictable and you kind of have a rhythm to it, it really helps build strength. And that's kind of what we hope with this book, that the hard parts that we hear emotionally about Oprah, I can sort of calm that down with a little bit of science. And if it's too overwhelming, the science gets too confusing, then you can kind of fall into a story.
Yeah, default to one of her stories or something.
Right.
Well, I feel like you've done that well, because I feel like that was exactly my experience. There was stress, in reading, distress probably is the word, distress in reading, and the feelings that it evoked in me and around others. But just exactly the way that you laid it out was brilliant, in the way that I could tolerate it. I could step back from a chapter. I could come back another day. And then, like you said, the stories and the science together were incredible. I think that's why I loved it so much. So trauma, is in the subtitle of your book. And for people who are in this field, this is not something they need. But if somebody's just tuning into the Hope for Mental Health community and they hear the word trauma, it's become a little bit of a buzzword in our culture. And it's used for everything from, I had the most traumatic experience at the grocery store today, and it just simply means that, something usually very trivial. And so we've sort of trivialized the word in popular culture. So for people who might not really know the difference between what I think you in the field call big T trauma and little t trauma, just really briefly on that, so that then we can kind of move into the core principles of the book.
Sure. So trauma, as you say, it's a term that everybody uses in everyday language. But from the perspective of either a scientist or somebody studying this as an academic, trauma is when a person experiences an event that causes an internal effect, the internal experience of being distressed, and activates your stress response system in such a way that there are changes in how that system is regulated. And then because of that, there are long-term effects: sleep problems, intrusive ideations, fears about certain things that were connected to the traumatic event. And I think that that's kind of important to remember. So again, in this pandemic, this will be traumatic for some people if they had somebody in their family die, or if they lost their job, or if there was an extreme stressor that caused distress and has long-term effects. But for people like me, it's not traumatic. It's distressing at times, but mostly it's an inconvenience. So I'm having this stress activation and frustration, but that's very, very small compared to what some people are experiencing. And I think it's, as you say, Kay, it's important to not trivialize that language, because when somebody says that they're traumatized by a nasty comment by a friend at lunch, and someone in the group actually has a history of being raped, that feels dismissive to them. Don't put my experience in the same category as you getting upset at lunch. So I think it's important to be precise about our language.
I was just talking to somebody the other day who was expressing sort of that almost weariness with the word and the term, and said, "Oh, trauma schmama." It's like he was. Now, this is from somebody who doesn't even realize the depth of his own early traumatic experiences, but he was just like so done, so over that term being used.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely not what we want, not what we're going after here. This is more to the, no, this is recognizing the seriousness and the impact, and the daily effect on the lives of probably billions. I mean, if you,
Easily.
yeah,
Easily. I
billions
mean,
of
you
people.
think about, we're so fortunate in the United States that many of the aspects of our sort of systems protect us to some degree from a lot of the things that other countries have to deal with, and people growing up in other environments. It's, we're very lucky. We're very fortunate people.
We are. So I think one of the things that was surprising to me was the emphasis that what you have learned about the effect of what happens to a baby in
Right.
its first 2 months of life.
Right.
I have to say that had not penetrated my consciousness. I could have told you early childhood and even infancy, but
Right.
I had no idea that window is so tiny and so narrow of what happens. So this is where I want you, Dr. Perry, to like do your deep dive. Talk to us about that. But
I
also,
might actually use some slides here.
I was going to say, this is where I would love for you to share slides, because I think they make things so clear. So please, yeah, just talk to us about that.
So you should be seeing some slides
We
here.
are.
All right. Now let me start with this one. The brain is incredibly complex, as we've talked about before, Kay. I mean, there's billions of neurons and there's trillions of connections, and the brain's always active. But to simplify it, you can think of it as an upside down triangle. And the top part is the part of our body that's most uniquely human. This is where we think. This is where speech and languages resides. This is where our values and beliefs are stored up in this top part of our brain. And as you go from the top down to the lowest part of your brain, you get down to these very regulatory net systems down here, the things that control heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, and so forth. Now, one of the things that's really, again, it's not really illustrated here, but the brain develops from the bottom to the top. So when you're born, your brainstem is pretty well organized, but your cortex, the part of your brain involved in values and speech and language, that's completely undeveloped. And I think anybody who's had a baby knows that. And so for the next 30 years, really, there's a process of kind of organizing from the bottom up to the top. And the final sort of, if you will, neurodevelopmental steps for maturity don't happen until you're 28 or 29 years old. So brain development is this long, extended process. Now, it's very front-loaded. And one of the most important things that happens is that there are these really important neurotransmitter networks. And I don't want to get too complex, but basically this is sort of like Grand Central Station. These systems go everywhere in your brain and everywhere in your body. So these systems basically are able to influence every function that a human being has. Think, feel, move, your heart rate, how your pancreas works, how your muscles work, everything. Now, it just so happens that one of the most important times in life to organize these networks and help determine how smoothly regulated and functional they are is in the first couple of months after life. And so the attentive, attuned, responsive caregiver is literally providing a whole set of pattern, repetitive experiences that organize this system. And if you have attentive, attuned caregiving, what happens is that part of the brain develops and you normally, and then as it influences organization, throughout all the rest of the brain, that goes very, very well. But if something happens that alters the development of that system, you end up with, if you have lots of incoming stress and distress, you have certain systems that get overactivated and certain systems that get deactivated. And so a chronically stressed or distressed system early in life leads to a whole set of underdeveloped, abnormally functioning higher parts of the brain. And so this can happen, the first 2 months of life can basically create a system down here that's sending abnormal signals to these higher parts of the brain. And then that later on, it will manifest in the way this child learns how to read. It'll manifest in the way this child forms relationships. And here you'll have this 4, 5, 6-year-old child struggling in these areas, and you're wondering what in the world is going on? Why are you acting that way? But if you look back and you go, oh, Tommy was adopted at 3 months of age, and in those first 3 months, there was chaos, threat. Mother was sometimes loving, sometimes gone, sometimes angry, sometimes frustrated. Just this early chaos leads to that overactivation and abnormality in these lower systems, which then will manifest itself as the child gets older.
You give some examples that were so fascinating to me. You talked about when you were talking about language and the development of language, and gave. Would you just explain that? Because to me, that was such an example of how the brain organizes. And if you have, well, you tell it, and then I'll tell you.
It's just about not that I don't remember what I wrote, but
you talked about it like if you have a caregiver that is, changes frequently, and maybe that.
Oh yeah. Okay. I get it. Okay. I know. So the way to think about it is that as the brain is developing early in life, it really needs sort of consistent signals to make these, what we call associations, to make these connections. And so early in life, if you had a caregiver that spoke English, and then all of a sudden at 2 months, that caregiver decided, I want the child to learn French. So all they spoke was French. And then you decided that, oh no, French isn't what we want. We want it to be Chinese. And so if you switched languages, 10 times, 15 times, by the time somebody was 3, they would have had insufficient repetition with any of the languages to be able to understand any language. And it's the same way with relational interactions. If you take a child and you pass that child from caregiver to caregiver to caregiver to caregiver, each one of them might be nice and might be providing positive things for the child. But because they're all slightly different, they smell different, they look different, their voice is different, the ability of the child's brain to kind of make sense out of what a human being is scrambled. And so they don't develop with normal attachment capabilities. And a lot of people see this with these kids that get into foster care, for example, that, the baby has a shelter caregiver, and then they have a foster parent, and then the foster parent is another foster home, and then there's an adoptive parent, and the adoptive parent might have somebody who takes care of the child during the day. And so the number of people early on can be overwhelming, too much so that the brain can't create consistency in making a worldview about what human beings are.
Talk to us a little bit more about worldview, because that's a pivotal point of how we're shaped by trauma, and it affects our worldview for the rest of our lives unless there's an interruption to that and healing takes place.
So again, the brain, the way the brain helps us make sense out of what's going on all over around us is that it takes in all of this sensory input through our senses, through what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we touch. And then that goes into the brain, excuse me, and then we make what we call associations. We connect a sight with a sound. We connect a sight with a certain touch. So when you see a 4-legged furry creature and it goes meow, you connect the sound with the image. And then later on, when you can touch a cat, you associate the furry touch with the meow, with the the image. And so your brain is essentially making sense out of the world. Now, as that happens, as you're beginning to build your internal catalog of things that are familiar, things that are safe, that's completely determined by the experiences you have early in life. And if you have parents and grandparents that are consistent and predictable and nurturing and loving, your brain begins to think that people, are good. You generalize from this small group of good people to all people. And then the next time you go out in the world as a 4-year-old, you see a human being at church and you smile at them. And you will, because humans are contagious, you will elicit a smile from a person who you've never seen before. And their brain will go, oh, look at that cute little child, and she's smiling at me, and you smile back, and sometimes you'll talk in this nice way. And of course, that worldview becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This child is projecting into the world what is inside of her. And then it literally will elicit from the world. And now the funny thing about that is the other part of the brain, and I don't talk about it too much in this book, but one of the things about the brain is that once you have a worldview, it goes into every interaction with a set of expectations that, you think that school is going to be fine. You think that this teacher is going to be nice. You think that this minister is going to be, is going to be nurturing and is going to be godlike. And so what'll happen is the first time someone does something that's not godlike or not Christ-like, your brain will go, well, he's having an off day, or this, or that. And then there'll be one thing that person does that's consistent with your worldview, and you go, oh, see, I'm right. So once you have a worldview, the interesting thing is your brain seeks out things that fit, and it sort of ignores things that don't fit. And so this is why, people can have incredibly varied ideas about a person or an interaction, even though they're looking at the same information. One person might think, well, it's okay if he is that way as long as he does these things. And this person will go, why aren't you paying attention to that part of this person? And it all has to do with, we carry around our own working version of the world. And our brain would rather be right about its worldview than be comfortable.
That's important. Could you say that again? That's a really important point.
Our brain would rather be right about its worldview than to actually experience something positive and good, et cetera, et cetera. So if you grew up in chaos and you think people are unpredictable, you actually feel more comfortable when there's chaos in the classroom than you do when the classroom is consistent and predictable and nurturing. In fact, there are kids who have had such a chaotic early life that they will, when they're in an environment where there's consistency and predictability, they start to feel so uncomfortable that they try to create chaos so that they can then feel like their view of the world is correct. And a teacher will say, Billy acts, we gave him a consequence and he acts like he likes it. Or our normal.
He does.
Exactly. And so this is where sort of learning about these issues can really help an educator.
But he likes it, not because he's bad, not because he's, a terrible kid. He likes it because, as you're saying, it fits in his worldview and it's what he knows. And that's where he feels comfortable.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And there's a lot of people who sabotage relationships because they have trouble with intimacy. And they feel more comfortable being the rejected person that fits their worldview better than the loved person. And it's a huge problem in many, many relationships, is that, when things are going well in the family, there will be there'll be this weird creation of chaos that, again, like you say, it just feels more comfortable for the person than non-chaos. And everybody around them goes, why are you like, in our field, one of the common things is you'll have a loving, person who came out of foster care, and they want to take good care of kids, and they want to be loving and kind, and so they'll foster one child and then two children, and then all of a sudden, you know, they'll take in a sibship group of 6, and all their friends go, "Why in the world are you doing that?"
Mm,
But they somehow feel more comfortable with that kind of chaos and being overexhausted and being a helper. And
interesting.
it's this really interesting sort of tightrope that we're trying to go, listen, it's wonderful that you're caring for these kids, but you don't need 12. Let's work on, do your wonderful, loving, nurturing thing with 4.
Mm.
And of course, the caseworker who's really stretched for placements is they're happy to give you a bunch
Sure.
of kids.
Wow. I want to talk about regulation and dysregulation in a minute, and resilience, because you give an incredible example in the book about that. But I wanted to just go back to one thing about that 2-month window for all that's happening to a newborn. And I was I'll probably say it not exactly right, but there was something about that a child who let's see, how was it? We tend to think that if a child, pardon me, was in an abusive or neglectful environment at 2 months, but then you give them lots and lots of care after that, maybe
Right.
they're adopted or in a foster home, that they're going to be fine. And you actually said that the situation is actually a little bit different than that.
Right. And sort of going back to the mechanism of how this really important set of networks organize. If you, in the first couple of months of life, provide safety, stability for the mother and the family, and the mother can then turn that into predictable, consistent caregiving for the child, that stress response system develops in a way that makes it resilient to future stressors. So a child who has this stability in the first couple of months and then gets into an environment where the family falls apart and there's chaos and abuse and neglect for the next 12 years, that child does better than the child who has the first 2 months of chaos, neglect, and trauma that causes a disorganized, reactive core regulatory network, which then disrupts development. And so even though, as you point out, Kay, this child is taken out of that bad environment and they have 13 years of consistent, predictable, loving caregiving, that child will have more problems with attention, impulsivity, learning, social problems than the child who had the first 2 months of consistent caregiving.
That feels counterintuitive.
Yeah.
It feels like that you should be able to mitigate, easily. You should be able to mitigate, wipe out, the bad things with lots and lots and lots of love and attention and a caring, new family or whatever. And so that was, I thought I did not know the research on that. And that blew me away.
Let me just sort of, I don't mean to jump on top of it, but I want to make sure people understand that the nuance of this, though. If the reason so many of these kids struggle is because the early childhood environment, the pediatrician, the psychologist, later on the school, all of the adult system that is trying to help that child typically doesn't understand development or trauma. And so they're looking at these children through the lens of a conventional, what's wrong with you? They're not looking at what happened to you. If you put that child into an environment where there's a developmentally informed, trauma-informed set of services, you can catch that child up. And in fact, we have data, we have a subset of kids that had these really bad starts and then got into homes where there was a lot of developmentally attuned services and professionals available, and they do get much better. But so that finding, Kay, is more of a comment on the inability of our systems to understand these kids than it is on the child's ability to change.
Yeah,
and so we're
thank you.
hopeful.
Thank you for distinguishing that, because that's really important.
It is important because
one is hopeful.
It's very hopeful.
Yeah.
It's very hopeful, Kay, because what that means is if more and more and more people learn about these things, those kids that get taken out of those environments will get the adequate relational, developmentally appropriate services, and they'll be able to get back on a healthy developmental trajectory. But right now they're misunderstood. because
Yeah.
we're not asking the right question.
Well, and that makes me, I'm going to just skip around here because that takes me to one of the things that you talk about is the school system and how the school system, there was this staggering quote about the number of children of color, particularly boys of color, that are evicted from pre-kindergarten.
Yeah.
So just talk a little bit about that because maybe the school system is not trauma informed in their care, and you define that as well. But talk about that for a little bit.
So when you look at preschool environments and early childhood environments, one of the things that you see, unfortunately, is that kids that have histories of chaos, threat, trauma, are going to have a harder time with, following directions, paying attention, keeping their hands to themselves. And when they get consequences or somebody tries to interact with them, they're much more likely to sort of be oppositional and then to kind of blow up and all of the things that make them a behavioral challenge. And so one of the things that we've seen is that these kids get kicked out of these preschool settings. So children get kicked out of preschool at a rate that's like 3 times the rate of being suspended from other grade levels. And if you look at who's getting kicked out, it's very disproportionately children of color, particularly young Black boys. Now, the unfortunate thing is if you are a Black boy and you are a white boy and you exhibit the same problems, the Black boy is much more likely to get suspended and kicked out compared to the white boy. And that's sort of an indicator of, both systemic sort of bias and implicit bias on the part of the adults involved. And so for me, this is one of our biggest problems, is that we already take this group of young children and we're setting them on a trajectory where, number one, they don't like school. And number two, they get pre-labeled. And so there have been many studies that show if you take a teacher and you say to the teacher, this child has ADHD and has a behavioral problem, when there's an incident in a classroom where they're equally involved with other kids, rather than distributing blame, 95% of the time they'll blame the kid that the teacher has already got a pre-existing thing. It goes back to what we were saying earlier, right? Yeah. Your brain is looking for evidence to reinforce what you know. So I've got Billy who's got ADHD, he's going to be a problem. And when there's a problem in the classroom, it's Billy. And so what happens is that process of being excluded, suspended, marginalized, it really is the first steps towards the school to prison pipeline that's been a big problem in our society. Yeah.
You spend a lot of, there's, pretty much a chapter on that. And it was really, it's worth reading, read that, you guys, even if you know something else, but that was so important to me. You talk a lot about, and this is maybe somewhere you might want to use one of your incredible slides, your graphs, pie charts, all those wonderful things that you've got, to talk about, there's so many things. There's state dependent functioning, which was the first time I heard that blew me away. Suddenly all of my relationships made sense. And I wanted to go back and redo every single one of them because there was so much power in that chart of explaining human relationships. And would you mind sharing that one a little bit?
Let me bring up my slides again. And I think I might leave them open like this and just sort of drift around. So sure. When we talk about state-dependent functioning, one of the things that we're really referring to is that, once you activate this stress-related system down here, one of the first things that happens is you'll shut down part of the thinking part of the brain. And so there are a couple ways to think about that are either more or less sophisticated. Here's the less sophisticated way to think about that. This set of slides I made, no offense to lawyers, but I made this to teach to lawyers and judges. But that when you have access to the top part of your brain, you're calm and you can use this really smart part of your brain. You can think about the future. You can reflect on the past. You can actually have a discussion with another person. And as you start to get and
May I
if
interrupt you just a second because you've got the number off to the right there?
and that is basically your IQ, or your sort of your problem solving ability. So if you were given a problem to solve, you would solve it with, pretty good IQ. If you take the same person, the very same person, and you give them a little bit of stress, like put them into a typical work environment and say, I want you to solve the same problem, but you've got to do it in within this 30-minute span before your next meeting. And you basically, rather than being internal and reflective and using all of your mental faculties, you feel a little bit more pressure. And so really what you do is you use pre-existing problem-solving solutions to the current situation, which means, again, you're actually not going to be as creative as you would. And then if you start to really get threatened and get lower parts of your brain, emotional parts of your brain, take over your functioning. And rather than actually having a discussion here where you're reflecting with people, you begin to actually, this becomes an interactive argument. And if you were asked to solve a problem, it would reflect a much lower IQ than if you had this reflective time. So the same person is literally dumber, more emotional, more categorical in their thinking than when they're calm. And so state dependent functioning is really, really important. And the other part about this that's really important, and I'm going to make this like this, is that human beings are contagious. That if you're a calm, relaxed, regulated adult and you've got a dysregulated child, ultimately just your very presence, as long as you stay calm and you use a little rhythm in your voice, pretty soon your tone and your affect is contagious and you can calm down a child. But you'll never calm down a child. We can't calm down somebody if we're very, very dysregulated. And in fact, if you're dysregulated, there's a high probability that you'll make the people around you feel equally dysregulated, and people will sort of regress into some sort of argumentative stance.
So what
And
happens if we continue down that? Well, you're getting there. Go ahead. You're gonna say it right there. Let's keep. Yeah.
so as you go down this continuum, here's right here might be if you were in a safe and familiar environment, maybe at the end of the day, you're at your own home, everything's familiar, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, you've got no sort of things that are causing you distress. You can really use that smart part of your brain. And then you go to work, and you are externally focused. You're focused on who's in the meeting, when's my next appointment. And again, you're using your cortex, but you're using pre-existing strategies to solve the current problem. And you're focused on the social milieu. You're continually focusing on, what do these people think? Do they like me? Do they understand this? All of that stuff. And that's what this flock means. You're sort of really tuned into the social milieu. And then if something happens and you get more threatened, this part of your brain starts to take over. And you're basically, if you are confronted or asked to solve a problem, you're kind of frozen. It's a little bit like if you get called on in the middle of a meeting to form an opinion or to weigh in on a new strategy. A lot of people will just go, sounds good, or they'll nod. They'll give that automatic response we were talking about, Kay, that's basically deflective. You're trying to get somebody to move on, back off, get away from me. But if they push you and you keep getting pushed and confronted and you get more fearful or something happens, you try to get away. And if you can't get away, you fight. Now, one of the ways that you can get away is to psychologically flee. And that's involves what we call dissociation. You just sort of, you're like a deer in the headlights, and you just sort of, you're just not, you're not there. but that's kind of a more sophisticated, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but
Oh, but the weeds are so interesting.
the weeds are interesting. Just to sort of give you a clue, I've got like 600 slides in this. So
See, I told you we need lots of hours. This is
we
not
could,
nearly
we
enough.
could go in and we could talk about all kinds of stuff,
I think what the first time that I saw this last year and then read it again in your book, what was so important to me was being unaware my whole life of moments in which I would react either in anger or in fear or I would be frozen, unable to respond, just kind of like the situation really required more from me, but I had nothing to give, and I couldn't really feel, and I couldn't come up with a response, and not knowing why.
right.
Not knowing why, and particularly around anger. I think for me, the times that I would, particularly in the closest relationships with my husband, with my kids, with, my closest friends or coworkers, is maybe just have that moment where I snap. I mean, I'm like, and I throw out some sarcastic remark, or my response is way beyond what the situation seemed to have elicit. But man, what was coming out was anger or fear or frozen, and not knowing why. And to see that chart and to see that something in that encounter, what you talk about as an evocative clue, there was the reason we do those kind of what in the world or where did that come from, is that somehow some encounter in that moment took us back in
Right.
ways that we aren't necessarily even able to articulate, to something that a memory that had formed based on an experience. And so we really are reacting out of our past, not even out of the moment. And to see that, and to see where in conversations or that I have, my brain has, I'm operating out of the lower part of my brain, and no wonder there's an argument. No wonder there's lack of understanding. I'm not at all able to move into the higher part of my brain to think and function and be creative. That was revolutionary to me.
Yeah.
I can't even tell you how important that was to me in understanding myself and relationships.
Kate, this is one of we have an approach that we call the neurosequential model. And one of the key parts of it is just what you're describing, is that just a little bit of understanding about how the brain processes experience can really lead to tremendous insights. And I think one of the key things in this is that most people underestimate how hard it is to really communicate. And so really communication is, I talked about this, here's your cortex, the smart part of your brain, right? And here's where all your values are and your beliefs, and you sort of formulate what you want to say to somebody. But in order to get those words out into space, you have to get through the emotional part of your brain. And so I'm going to change this a little bit. Let's say that you see a neighbor who you really have had, you've heard that they've been saying nasty things about you. And the part of your brain up here says, well, I'm going to be the bigger person. I'm going to go and say hello to them, greet them, as part of my job as the minister's wife, whatever. And so the problem is that has to get through that emotional part of your brain. So when you say it's good to see you, it's going to sound completely different than when you say it's good to see you to somebody you really want to see. Right?
Yes.
I mean, try hard.
Yes.
You're like, but it's not exactly going to come out the same way. And then, of course, it has to get through the really primitive part of their brain, through their own emotional filters, and get up into their own cortex. And so the key is that when anybody communicates, it's never cortex to cortex. It has to go through all of these little steps. And here's a classic example. Here's a child who's got a history of relational rejection. And here's the frustrated adult who says, we need to talk. And what happens is it comes out, a little bit of frustration, I don't want to, we need to talk, and sort of a tiny little bit of tone in the voice. It gets into this child who has this sort of evocative, this set of associations about never being enough, always being rejected, and it'll get turned into, he hates me and they want to move me. And literally, that's not what you said, but that's literally what they're going to hear. And this miscommunication thing happens between, I mean, this happens with people who know each other and love each other for years. Imagine how often there are these miscommunications between people who don't know each other very well, or who don't know, a lot of people you interact with, you don't know what their previous experience is. So when I'm here, I'm a tall white man interacting with a small black boy. There are going to be a lot of landmines for both of us. My little implicit bias stuff that comes from growing up with a bunch of white people in North Dakota, his implicit bias things that are going to be based upon real experiences, watching white cops shake down his dad. How am I supposed to form this sort of trusting, intimate relationship so he tells me all about the bad things that happened to him? We have to get through all this stuff. And that's one of the biggest, hardest parts of human communication. It's this, there's always going to be ruptures.
So communication, as you said, is probably one of the most difficult things. I've always said that I can't wait for heaven, because in heaven, communication will be perfect. That's what I'm holding out for, because it is so far from perfect here. But if you add then trauma, I mean, serious trauma, things that have really broken trust or caused wounds, it has just got to exacerbate the difficulties that we have in communicating.
Absolutely, Kay. And this is, and the thing is, it doesn't have to be big, huge trauma either. There's lots of people who have had sort of cold, distant parenting, or disapproving parenting, or just the kinds of things that you become exquisitely sensitive to and you carry forward in life. And so when you sense that your partner is giving you just the tiniest little, even nonverbal disengagement, it might feel huge, that like it's a bigger rejection than it really is intended to be, but you feel it that way.
Yeah.
And this is just the nature of human communication. Even when it's with people who love each other and know each other, it's fraught with rupture and the need to repair.
Well, that's why that particular chart to me is human relationships on, with a few lines and a few words. It just explains so much. I want to talk we could talk forever about resilience. Again, it's another buzzword that is used, and people usually mean different things. We don't always mean the same thing from it. And so you give a beautiful example in the book of what resilience, it's not this, it's more like this. And I don't want to steal that from you, but that made, again, such perfect sense to me of understanding, because we say trauma changes people. We're never the same after trauma. And then you give this incredible example then of what resilience might and might not mean.
Was this the thing with the hanger and the?
Yes.
Okay.
It's really good.
I have to say, okay, it's sort of embarrassing, because one of the things that we do, and I write and I use the real names of the people, and then we change the names.
Yes.
So somebody will say,
be protective of the people that really happened to.
You remember the story of Thomas? I'm like,
yeah. Thomas who? Yeah.
All right.
And also when you write, if you don't write, people don't know, you write books way before they actually get published, and you're already working on other things by the time it comes out, and you're like, okay, what did I say?
Exactly. So resilience is developmental trauma, or any kind of trauma, it will inevitably change the biology of the person. Now, that person may be able to get back to some previous level of functioning, but it's not without some sort of physiological cost. And so the example I gave of it is that if you take a hanger and you drop a ring into a sink, and you need to pull something out. So you take the hanger and you bend it into the shape you need, and the hook you need to kind of get the ring out. You've stressed, and in a very significant way, that hanger. And when you return the hanger to its normal shape, to be a hanger, its normal, hanger function, you try to bend it as best you can, but it's going to be weak at the places that you bent it, and it's going to be a little bit crooked. It's not going to be exactly the same. Now, you can put a shirt on and hang it in the closet, but it's not exactly the same. And that's kind of what real resilience is. It's the ability to kind of, through experience, to get back to previous functional capability, but not previous physiological status. And I think that's important. A lot of people think about resilience as this, you have a Nerf ball and you just squeeze it and then you let go of it. No, I'm back exactly to the way I was before. And that's just not the way the human body works.
That was so important for me, again, because I've said the same thing around catastrophic grief. Well, grief of any kind changes you. I think when violence is associated with that death and that grief, it adds some layers. And so when I've said that catastrophic grief and loss has changed us, I'm not being dramatic I'm not exaggerating. I'm not the same person that I was before my son died violently in suicide. And to realize that resilience doesn't mean that as I'm growing and healing over these years that I am that Nerf, I'm that ball, that nothing has changed about me. I'm the same. I'm exactly like I was. That is such an unrealistic expectation of people, put such a burden of pressure to have the way you've changed not be acknowledged. And that example then of the hanger, that was perfect to me. It's like, yes, I am a slightly twisted.
Listen, I'll tell you what, I'm a bent hanger. Just, and I'm proud of it,
Yeah, it's like, no, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed that trauma and grief have changed and shifted me. But that leads me to the last part of the book, the last 3 or 4 chapters, so much about healing, about connection. Oprah speaks of that in spite of all the trauma that was her childhood, the church was an anchor point for her because of the community that was found, because they did everything together. And so you guys spend a lot of time talking about the value of, now for me and for a lot of the listeners, it is a real church. With it, I'm saying there is value in a real church. You and Oprah talk about church even as a metaphor for what we need in terms of healing. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and again, a lot of this is sort of derived from spending time with elders in multiple different cultures, and recognizing from our own work and from just studying the history of humanity that we're biological creatures and we're neurobiologically intended to be interconnected. We're meant to live in groups. And when we are in the presence of people we belong with, it makes our stress response systems better regulated. It activates the reward neurobiology in us. And that leads to this cascade of physiological health. It's a form of powerful resilience. So in the presence of any stressor, you can buffer that much better when you're in community, and you can heal best in community. And so I think that if you are part of a community of faith and there's real live people that you see and you care for, that is much more therapeutic than going to see the best therapist on the planet once a week. And again, we talk a little bit about this, but what we've learned is that the neurobiology of change, whether it's learning a cognitive concept, developing a social skill, healing the stress response system, whatever it is, it's much more the product of thousands of tiny little moments as opposed to one big dose of, therapeutic stuff once a week. And so when you're living in community, and I think church community is a wonderful way to do it, because it also incorporates pattern repetitive rhythmic interactions from the song. It incorporates a meaningful belief system that is a huge part of making sense out of all of the things that you've experienced. When you have those things, you're really in this protected environment that is the way human beings are meant to live. And I think that those of you who are part of a church are lucky. And those of you who are not, it's worth trying to find a church home, a people in your life. And I think in this secular world, more and more people are just desperately hungry to belong. And I think a lot of the maladaptive behaviors and things that we see in people are these attempts to find a church home, to
A
find
tribe, a home, a group.
community.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
I think you mentioned, I liked what you said, because I really agree that this is one of the benefits of being in a really loving, caring faith community is you talked about, you could maybe you see a therapist once a week, and there's if you've got a good therapist, there's real value in that, and
absolutely.
it's good stuff, and encourage that. But if you're with a therapist for an hour a week, what do you do with all those other hours? Where do you go to find community and connectiveness and those repeated activities of feeling like you're close and you belong? And that is one of the benefits of a faith community, is that there are many opportunities every week to be together with those same people. It could be in a service project. It could be in studying the Bible. It could be in a weekend worship service. It could be in just hanging out together. But there's that repetitive connection with loving, caring people that can do so much around healing of trauma and the what happened to us. I would just want to read one thing that Oprah said at the very end as we close, when she was talking about healing. And you talk about that the major tool you have in helping others change, whether you are a parent, teacher, coach, therapist, or friend, is you. Relationships are the currency of change. And then she responds, we have to take care of ourselves so that we can bring ourselves. She said, this is especially important considering that so many of us are walking around with trauma or adversity in our pasts. I wouldn't be who I am without my trauma, so I own it. I claim it. And by doing that, I believe I have found a way to use it in service to others. Empathy, compassion, and forgiveness. These are all part of the practice that moves me forward in every decision or encounter I experience. And then I will say, because you probably don't remember the brilliance of your quote, you answer with, yes, though the cost of wisdom can be the cost of wisdom, though, can be very high. And for many people, the pain never goes away. The wise learn how to carry their burden with grace, often to protect others from the emotional intensity of their pain. I like that phrase. The wise learn how to carry their burden with grace. So we talked at the very beginning of, you said if you had a hope for this book, your biggest hope would be that there would be others listening who would say, I want to give my life. That's something I want to give my life to. I want to help people understand trauma. I want to help them heal. So just as we close, what does that look like to carry that burden with grace?
Well, I think a big part of it is to be externally faced in the focus of your life. That if you are continually focused on yourself and your own pain and your own, but it happened to me and that's not fair, you're just going to basically, you're just shifting around your burden. And the real, I think it's, oddly enough, it's so much easier to carry the burden of these experiences when you look outwardly and try to see how you can help others and make the world a better place. And if you do that, it's easier to carry.
It is easier to carry. I would concur. Everybody, you have to get this book. It's amazing. I've stayed up late several nights. I showed you my copy, all the little stickies, more to add. Thank you, Dr. Perry. Thank you for, not only the book, but thank you for the decades of where you have used your own life in such ways that make us, give the rest of us some healing. And I deeply appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kay. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks.